Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Plague of Athens. The first epidemic in recorded Western history didn't just kill, it convinced an entire civilization that the gods had abandoned them, and the behavioral collapse that followed may have done more damage than the disease itself. In the late summer of 430 BCE, the city-state of Athens was 2 years into the Peloponnesian War against Sparta. The Athenian strategos Pericles had ordered a deliberate policy of drawing the civilian population from the surrounding countryside inside the city's long walls, a defensive corridor connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus, roughly 5.5 miles long. The walls were sound. The strategy was defensible. What Pericles had not calculated was what happens when you compress tens of thousands of rural people, unacclimated to urban disease conditions, into a corridor that had been designed for movement, not habitation. The population density in that stretch by late summer was enough that people were sleeping in the towers of the walls themselves. Then, according to the historian Thucydides, who contracted the disease himself and survived, people began dying in the streets. Thucydides recorded what he witnessed with the precision of a man who understood that no one would believe him later. He described the onset: a violent heat in the head, redness and inflammation spreading to the eyes, then descending to the throat and tongue. The breath, he wrote, became fetid and unnatural. Sneezing came first, then hoarseness, then a cough that moved into the chest with a force that bent the body. Vomiting of every kind of bile followed. The skin, he noted, reddened and broke into small pustules and ulcerations. The afflicted could not bear the touch of clothing. Many threw themselves into cisterns, and one can picture them not metaphorically but literally, lowering themselves into the cold water of public wells and cisterns while passers-by stepped around them. The thirst was unquenchable. The disease killed within 7 to 9 days in the majority of cases. Those who survived often lost their fingers, their toes, or their sight. Thucydides himself was one of the survivors who emerged with permanent physical changes. He did not specify which ones. The epidemic moved through the Athenian military encampment at Potidaea, carried there by soldiers who had been in contact with Piraeus. The Spartan army, which had come to ravage Attica and expected to meet resistance, instead found an enemy that was already collapsing inward. The Spartans withdrew without engaging. They had heard what was happening inside the walls, and they did not want it. The plague's presence in the historical record is unusually direct. Thucydides wrote about it as a living participant, not a chronicler, but the official Athenian state record of casualties was never formally compiled. What Pericles announced to the assembly was carefully managed. The scale of military deaths was underreported in public addresses. The speeches continued. The assembly continued to meet. Outside, the bodies were stacked. The epidemic was eventually attributed, in later Athenian accounts, to deliberate Spartan poisoning of the water supply at Piraeus, a theory that Thucydides explicitly dismissed as politically motivated. In the 2nd century CE, the physician Galen reviewed the account and noted its consistency with a hemorrhagic fever of some kind. The official position of classical historians through most of the modern period described the plague as an isolated wartime catastrophe, contained, concluded, and resolved by the withdrawal of conditions that enabled it. Epidemiologists in the late 20th century began requesting permission to examine burials beneath the Kerameikos district of Athens. But the official framing does not address what Thucydides documented most carefully, which was not the disease itself but the social behavior it produced. He described a city in which people stopped burying their dead according to custom. Funeral rites, the cornerstone of Athenian religious obligation, were abandoned. Bodies were deposited on pyres that had been built for other families' dead. People who had previously lived within strict moral frameworks began acting as though the law no longer applied to them, because, as Thucydides wrote, the penalties of law seemed too slow compared to the penalties the disease was already exacting. He called this anomia, lawlessness born not from rebellion, but from the rational calculation that there was no future in which consequences would arrive. Athens never fully recovered its civic confidence. The war with Sparta continued for another 26 years. The city that emerged was not the city that had entered. The plague ran through Athens for at least 4 years, returned in a second wave, and touched a population of perhaps 300,000 people at its peak, leaving behind a civilization that had learned, in the most direct way available, that collective behavior can collapse faster than any wall. Number 9. The Antonine Plague. Rome was the largest city in the Western world when a returning army walked something home from the east, and the empire it infected was never structurally the same again. In the spring of 165 CE, Roman legions returning from a campaign against the Parthian Empire entered the Syrian city of Seleucia on the Tigris and sacked it. The soldiers were disciplined, the campaign had been tactically successful, and the columns that marched westward back toward Roman territory were in good order. They moved along the network of military roads that connected the eastern frontier to the Rhine and the Danube. passing through garrison towns, supply depots, and civilian settlements in sequence. The first recorded deaths matching the subsequent epidemic appeared in the army camps of the eastern frontier provinces within weeks of the army's return. By 166 CE, the disease had reached Rome itself, moving through the capital at a rate that required the physician Galen, who would later serve Marcus Aurelius and who kept systematic records of what he observed, to leave the city for his home province of Pergamon. He left, he later wrote, because the demand for his services had exceeded what any single physician could address. He returned when summoned by the emperor. Galen's clinical observations of the Antonine plague constitute the most detailed medical record of any ancient epidemic in the Western tradition. He described a skin eruption that appeared on the 9th day of illness, a pustular rash that dried and fell away as a black crust. He noted that patients who survived past the eruption tended to recover. Those whose rashes did not dry, but instead ulcerated into the interior tissue, did not. He observed that the interior of the mouth and throat developed comparable lesions, and that diarrhea was present in fatal cases but absent in recoveries. He recorded a distinguishing feature, a black, putrid stool in the cases that ended in death, which appeared shortly before the patient lost consciousness. The consistency of this final symptom allowed him to make prognoses with an accuracy that impressed his contemporaries. The disease killed, he estimated in his notes, roughly a quarter of those it infected in any given cohort. In the legions, the proportion was higher, soldiers camped in close quarters with no ability to isolate. The epidemic entered the Roman historical record through the Augustan History, a collection of biographies of emperors compiled centuries later. The Augustan History noted that Marcus Aurelius conducted propitiatory sacrifices and consulted oracles during the height of the plague years. What it did not record in any systematic way was the mortality toll. The figure that circulated in Rome, 2,000 deaths per day in the city at the epidemic's height, appears in the Historia Augusta and was not corroborated by any census mechanism. The census itself had lapsed. The official state apparatus continued to function, dispatching edicts, collecting taxes, prosecuting wars. The private letters of Marcus Aurelius do not mention the plague directly. His meditations, written during the worst years of the epidemic, mention mortality in philosophical terms. The Antonine plague was formally classified by later historians as almost certainly a smallpox outbreak, the first major smallpox epidemic in documented European history, based on Galen's symptom descriptions. This classification, offered cautiously in the 20th century and accepted broadly by the mid-1990s, arrived without fanfare in academic literature. The reclassification did not change any monument, any commemoration, any institutional memory. The plague had no dedicated memorial in Rome. Its dead were absorbed into the statistical silence of an empire that did not count its non-military casualties in any systematic form. The epidemic returned in a second wave in 189 CE under the Emperor Commodus, killing at a rate that Roman sources described as the worst pestilence in memory. And yet the official smallpox attribution, while almost certainly correct on clinical grounds, does not resolve the geographic question that the pattern of Roman mortality raises. The disease moved through the empire along the road system, which is expected, but it also moved along the grain supply routes in ways that don't fully correspond to military movement. It appeared in North Africa and Britain, in a sequence that suggests a second vector of transmission, separate from the returning army, operating along commercial shipping lanes. The Roman road system connected roughly 2 million square miles of territory at the time of the Antonine plague, a pathogen that learned to navigate that infrastructure, and the Antonine plague clearly did had access to a human network that would not exist again at comparable scale for another 1,000 years. Number 8. The Plague of Justinian. The first recorded global pandemic in human history arrived by grain ship, moved through the Byzantine Empire's tax records like a ghost, and may have postponed the reunification of Europe by 6 centuries. On a morning in late 541 CE, in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium at the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, the harbor workers began dying. The historian Procopius of Caesarea, who was present in Constantinople when the plague arrived there, and who wrote the most detailed contemporary account of what followed, described the onset of illness precisely. A sudden fever, mild enough at first that those who felt it continued working. Within hours, a swelling appeared in the groin, in the armpit, or behind the ear. The swelling was hard like a knot beneath the skin, and it grew. Some patients fell into a coma and died without ever fully registering that they were ill. Others developed hallucinations, rose from their beds, walked into the street, and required restraining. Others developed the black pustules on the skin that indicated a third and uniformly fatal course. Procopius noted with visible discomfort that the disease made no distinction of any kind. not by age, not by diet, not by moral character, not by the prayers offered or the saints invoked. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, who was in the middle of a military campaign to reconquer the western territories of the former Roman Empire, contracted the disease himself in 542 CE. He survived. His general Belisarius, who had retaken North Africa and was pressing into Italy, was recalled. The campaign was suspended. John of Ephesus, a bishop and chronicler who traveled through the eastern Mediterranean during the plague years, described the agricultural collapse in explicit physical terms. He walked through fields of ripened wheat that no one had come to harvest, the grain falling unharvested to the ground while the farmers who had planted it lay in mass graves outside the nearest town. He described carts of bodies being pushed through city streets, stopping not because they were full but because the men pushing them had died mid-route. He described a smell across the eastern Mediterranean that he said was recognizable at sea before a ship reached harbor in the summer months of the worst years. The plague reached Constantinople in the spring of 542 CE and immediately entered the imperial administrative record in the form of a problem. The tax system required bodies to be counted, and the bodies were no longer countable. Imperial tax collectors reported to the capital that entire villages had been emptied, that assessments made the previous year were uncollectible because the assessed were dead, and that the normal mechanisms for updating the rolls had broken down because the scribes were also dying. The official response was to suspend certain categories of tax collection and to issue a series of edicts about the handling of property abandoned by the deceased. These edicts survive. The death toll they imply is not stated anywhere in them. The plague of Justinian was identified in the 20th century as caused by Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the later Black Death, based on analysis of skeletal remains from burial sites in Bavaria and France that dated to the 6th century CE. DNA recovered from tooth pulp confirmed the pathogen in studies published between 2013 and 2019. The identification was accepted without significant academic controversy. The framing of the plague in Byzantine historiography was officially one of divine punishment and imperial resilience. The emperor commissioned churches. The Hagia Sophia, completed in 537 CE, stood through the worst years of the epidemic. The official narrative emphasized continuity. But the official narrative of resilience does not address the demographic gap that the plague carved into the 6th century Mediterranean world. The epidemic returned in waves, at least 15 distinct recurrences between 541 and 750 CE, roughly once every 11 to 12 years, which is the interval at which a new generation with no acquired immunity would have reached the age most vulnerable to plague exposure. Each wave reinfected a population that had partially recovered. The cumulative mortality across those 2 centuries has been estimated, in modern demographic studies, at somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in a world whose total population was perhaps 200 million. That is a range so wide that it should be stated plainly. We do not know. The records that would allow a precise count were kept by a civilization that was, in significant part, dying while it was keeping them. If you're finding this worth your time, go ahead and subscribe. There are more videos like this one waiting for you. Number 7. The Black Death. The most documented epidemic in pre-modern European history killed so many people in so short a time that the survivors couldn't process it, and the psychological residue reshaped European civilization in ways that are still structurally legible today. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina after sailing from the Black Sea port of Kaffa, where a Mongol army had been catapulting the bodies of its own plague dead over the city walls as a siege tactic. When the harbor masters at Messina came aboard the ships, most of the sailors were already dead. Those still alive were covered in black swellings in the groin and the armpits at the neck that oozed blood and pus. The harbor masters ordered the ships out of the port immediately. The ships had already been in the harbor for several days. The Sicilian authorities sent the ships away and closed the port. They were approximately 2 weeks too late. The Flemish physician Simon de Cavino, writing from Liege in 1350, described the plague's behavior with an attention to differential case patterns that would not have been out of place in a modern clinical report. He noted 3 distinct presentations: the bubonic form, in which the lymph node swellings were prominent and the patient might survive if the swellings burst and drained; the pneumonic form, in which the lung was involved and the patient died within 2 to 3 days, coughing blood; and the septicemic form, in which the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, producing no visible swellings at all, and in which death occurred so rapidly that patients were found dead who had shown no symptoms the previous evening. The septicemic form was the one that most disrupted the conventional understanding of disease transmission. People were dying who had, as far as anyone could determine, had no contact with the sick. Doors were found locked from the inside with occupants dead within. A household would retire in apparent health and be found the next morning with its entire membership dead. The contemporary explanation was miasmatic bad air corrupted by the dead. It was wrong, but it was not irrational because the disease did seem to move through the air and the pneumonic form did. The Black Death entered the European historical and cultural record with a force that no previous epidemic had achieved, in part because Europe in 1347 had a functioning literate class, clergy, merchants, notaries, who kept records and continued keeping them even as they died in sequence. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani began writing an account of the plague and died before he could finish it. His account ends mid-sentence. The notarial records of cities across northern Italy, southern France, and Catalonia from 1347 to 1351 show a surge in will writing so extreme that the profession of notary became, briefly, one of the most dangerous in Europe, not because of any particular exposure risk, but because notaries were called to the bedsides of the dying and therefore spent more continuous time in the presence of infectious patients than almost any other professional class. The church kept burial records. The records stop. They start again. The gap between them is the Black Death. The official medieval explanation, God's punishment for collective sin, was promulgated by the Church and accepted broadly enough that public flagellant processions moved through European cities, groups of men beating themselves bloody in the streets in the hope of preempting divine judgment. This explanation was officially supplemented in 1348 by the Paris Medical Faculty, which issued a formal report attributing the epidemic to a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars on the 20th of March, 1345, which had caused a corruption of the surrounding air. The report was authoritative. It was distributed. It was wrong. The bacteriological cause, Yersinia pestis, was identified by the Swiss-French physician Alexander Yersin in Hong Kong in 1894 during an outbreak of the Third Plague pandemic. The medieval dead had been waiting 5.5 centuries for a name. And yet the bacteriological identification, while correct, does not resolve the scale problem that medieval demographic records present. The accepted mortality figure for the Black Death in Europe is between 1/3 of the total population, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people dead in roughly 5 years on a continent of perhaps 75 million. But the European figure is a fraction of the global toll. The same epidemic, the same pathogen moving along the same Mongol trade routes that had carried it from Central Asia, had already torn through China, the Middle East, and North Africa before it reached Sicily. The Chinese census records of the Yuan dynasty show a population decline between 1200 and 1400 of roughly 40 million people. The Mamluk historian al-Makhrizi described Cairo losing roughly a quarter of its population in a matter of months. When the full geographic range of the Black Death's first wave is mapped, from the steppes of Central Asia to the coast of Ireland, from Norway to the Sahel, it covers an area large enough to contain every major human civilization then existing in the Eastern Hemisphere. It was not a European event, it was a planetary one. Number 6. The Cocoliztli epidemic. The deadliest epidemic in recorded North American history has a name almost no one outside of Mexico has heard, and the pathogen that caused it took nearly 500 years to identify. In the summer of 1545, in the central valleys of what is now Mexico, people began dying of something that moved faster than any disease the indigenous Nahua population had a framework to categorize. The Spanish friar Juan de Zumárraga, Bishop of Mexico City, wrote to the Spanish crown in August of that year describing a pestilence so severe that the missions could not keep pace with the dying. He did not describe the disease in clinical terms. He described the logistics of burial. The friars were digging trenches. The trenches were not large enough. They were digging more trenches. The Nahua called the disease Cocoliztli, a Nahuatl word meaning roughly pestilence or plague, a categorical term rather than a specific one, which tells us something about how the population experienced it, not as one disease among many but as disease in its most extreme and unqualified form. Francisco Hernandez, the personal physician to King Philip II of Spain and the first European-trained doctor to conduct a systematic medical survey of New Spain, arrived in Mexico in 1570 and spent 7 years documenting indigenous plants, animals, and disease histories. His account of the Cocoliztli, compiled from interviews with survivors and from his own clinical observations of a later outbreak in 1576, described the symptoms with a specificity unusual for the period. High fever with intense heat radiating from the body, severe headache, vertigo, black tongue, dark urine, dysentery, chest pain, nodules behind the ear, and profound jaundice. The eyes, he wrote, turned yellow. Blood flowed from the nose. The patients who developed the bleeding from the nose in his observation died. The patients who did not sometimes survived. Death came within 3 to 4 days of the onset of visible symptoms. Hernandez estimated, based on his interviews, that the 1545 epidemic had killed somewhere between 5 and 15 million people. He wrote the number and did not annotate it with disbelief. He had seen the empty villages. The Cocoliztli entered the historical record of New Spain as a catastrophe acknowledged but not fully accounted for. Spanish colonial administrative records, tribute rolls, census surveys, church baptism and burial registers document the population collapse in the central Mexican highlands with bureaucratic precision. The number of tribute-paying households in a given district dropped from several thousand to a few hundred in the span of 2 years. Colonial administrators noted the shortfall in tax revenue and wrote to Spain requesting revised tribute expectations. Spain revised the figures. The correspondence continued. The dead are visible in the gaps between one set of numbers and the next. The 1545 and 1576 Cocoliztli epidemics were attributed by Spanish authorities to a combination of drought, famine, and the general weakness of a population already reduced by earlier epidemics. This attribution, environmental stress as cause rather than as contributing factor, was the framing that persisted in colonial historiography for centuries. The 16th century epidemics in Mexico were categorized broadly as consequences of the conquest, a framing accurate enough in the large sense to discourage more precise investigation. In 2018, a team of researchers led by Aschild Vagin of the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History extracted and sequenced DNA from the teeth of individuals buried in a Cocoliztli cemetery in Oaxaca. The pathogen they identified was a strain of Salmonella enterica, specifically a paratyphoid variant now called S. paratyphi, consistent with an enteric fever that would have been particularly lethal in a population weakened by drought-induced famine and already compromised by previous epidemic exposure. The finding was published in Nature Ecology and Evolution. It received modest press coverage. But the Salmonella identification, while specific and well-evidenced, addresses the 1545 outbreak and may not explain the 1576 recurrence, which killed an estimated 2 million additional people with a speed that suggests either a second pathogen or a particularly virulent variant. The two epidemics together, in a highland Mexico that had also absorbed the smallpox, measles, and typhus outbreaks of the preceding decades, reduced the indigenous population of central Mexico from an estimated 22 to 25 million at the time of first Spanish contact to approximately 1 million by the early 17th century. That reduction, from a population larger than any contemporary European nation to a remnant, occurred in less than 80 years. The Cocoliztli alone accounts in most modern demographic reconstructions for the single largest drop in that sequence. It was not the most famous epidemic of the Columbian era. It was, by the numbers available, the deadliest. Number 5. The Cyprian Plague. A 3rd century epidemic in the Roman Empire killed at a rate that broke the army, broke the tax system, and produced an entire theological movement organized around the premise that death on this scale could only be a gift. In the spring of 249 CE, in the city of Alexandria, then the second largest city in the Roman Empire and its primary intellectual and commercial hub, a new disease appeared in the harbor district and moved inward through the population with a speed that the contemporary record found difficult to contextualize. Within 2 years, it had spread to every province of the empire. The Bishop of Carthage, Cyprian, who gave the epidemic his name by writing the most extended contemporary description of it, was not a physician. He was a theologian. His treatise, De Mortalitate on Mortality, was written as a pastoral address to his congregation, which was dying around him as he wrote. He described what he saw not to diagnose but to console, and the clinical detail that emerges incidentally from his consolations is the more striking for being unintentional. He described bowels loosened into continuous flux. He described vomiting that did not stop. He described eyes inflamed with blood. He described the feet and limbs of some patients turning gangrenous, the tissue dying while the patient was still alive, and the patients continuing to move through the streets on feet that were rotting beneath them. He described the throat on fire with sores. He wrote all of this in the service of an argument that what was happening was good, that the faithful should welcome death as a transit to God, and the argument must have been difficult to make because the death he was describing was extreme. The epidemic's clinical presentation was recorded most thoroughly by the physician Zosimus and by later summarizing accounts, but the primary data points come from Cyprian's non-medical text and from the Alexandrian bishop Dionysius, who wrote letters to neighboring communities during the epidemic's peak. Dionysius described Alexandria's population as reduced to a fraction of its former size, A city that had held perhaps 500,000 people was, by his account, emptied to the point that the remaining inhabitants could not fill the public spaces. He noted that the Christians in the city were burying the pagan dead as well as their own, because the pagan burial workers had died or fled, and the bodies were in the streets. He described Christian volunteers carrying the bodies of strangers to graves and then dying of the same disease within days of performing the service. He did not express surprise at this, it was simply what was happening. The Cyprian plague entered the official Roman historical record primarily through its administrative consequences, which were severe and immediate. The Roman state had been functioning under what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of military instability, political assassination, and economic deterioration that ran from 235 to 284 CE. The epidemic began in 249 CE in the middle of this crisis, and its effect on military recruitment, tax revenue, and civil administration was noted in imperial edicts that attempted to address the collapse of the normal mechanisms of governance. The Emperor Decius, who was on the throne when the plague began, died in battle in 251 CE. His successors, there were many of them, none lasting long, each issued their own plague-related administrative adjustments. The empire continued. The official record treats the epidemic as one pressure among several. The Cyprian plague was formally analyzed, in terms of potential causation, by a research team excavating a mass burial site in Luxor, Egypt, ancient Thebes, beginning in 2013. The excavators, working under the auspices of the Italian archaeological mission to Luxor, found a mass grave containing bodies covered in a thick layer of lime. Near the grave, they found a kiln that had been used to produce the lime, and large ceramic vessels that had contained some biological material. The lime treatment was consistent with an attempt at disinfection or pathogen suppression, a deliberate public health measure. DNA analysis of the remains was inconclusive regarding a specific pathogen. Proposals in the academic literature have ranged from smallpox to Ebola to an ancestral filovirus to pandemic influenza. No consensus has been reached. And yet the absence of a confirmed pathogen identification, after more than 1,700 years with the physical remains in hand, is itself a data point. The Cyprian plague ran for at least 14 years. It killed an estimated 5,000 people per day in Rome at its peak, according to the Historia Augusta. That figure may be embellished, but the 14-year duration is well documented in the letter records, the imperial edicts, and the archaeological layer. An epidemic that runs for 14 years is not an outbreak. It is a new condition of life. The Roman world that emerged from the 3rd century, smaller, more militarized, more religiously oriented toward personal salvation, less confident in the permanence of institutions, was in measurable demographic ways a different civilization than the one that had entered it. The Cyprian plague did not cause all of those changes. But it was present for all of them, running underneath the political history like a sustained note that the official record heard but did not transcribe. If this is the kind of content you're here for, hit subscribe, we make these regularly. Number 4. The Prehistoric Smallpox Epidemic. Genetic evidence published in the 21st century has pushed smallpox's origin far earlier than anyone believed, revealing that the most lethal single pathogen in human history was killing people for thousands of years before anyone recognized what it was. In 2020, a team of geneticists led by Charlotte Honap at the University of Oklahoma and Anna Duggan at McMaster University published a study in Science Advances that changed the timeline of smallpox in a way that has not yet fully penetrated public understanding. Working from ancient DNA extracted from 17 individuals, 11 from Viking Age Northern Europe, 6 from earlier Bronze Age and Iron Age sites, they recovered variola virus genomes with dates ranging from the 7th century CE back to approximately 2500 BCE. The variola recovered from the earlier samples was not identical to the historical smallpox that killed hundreds of millions in the modern era. It was a distinct variant, one that lacked some of the specific genetic features that make modern variola particularly lethal to humans, but it was recognizable as smallpox. It was present in northern European populations more than 4,000 years ago, circulating through communities that left no written record of what it was doing to them. The physical evidence is sparse by definition. Ancient DNA degrades and most Bronze Age burials have not been analyzed for pathogen content, but the samples that have been recovered allow certain inferences. Barbara Muhleman of the University of Cambridge, one of the co-authors on the 2020 study, noted in subsequent interviews that the distribution of the ancient variola samples across multiple unconnected geographic sites suggests that the virus was not a rare phenomenon but a widespread endemic pathogen circulating through European and possibly Eurasian populations for millennia, before the first recorded epidemics. The individuals in whose teeth the ancient variole was found had not been buried in mass graves. They were individuals buried in the ordinary manner of their period. Smallpox in the archaeological record looks like background mortality, unremarkable, unexceptional, the ordinary condition of dying. The ancient variole findings entered the scientific literature in a peer-reviewed journal and were covered by science journalists in the usual way. The story ran for a news cycle and faded. The dominant cultural understanding of smallpox continues to be organized around its role in the post-Columbian Americas and its eradication in 1980. The Bronze Age samples appear in specialist literature without broader memorial. They have not changed any museum exhibit, any commemorative practice, any historical narrative of ancient disease. The populations that carried them have no names. The official scientific position is that the ancient variola variant and the modern variola major and variola minor strains represent an evolutionary lineage, with the more lethal modern strains developing their characteristic lethality during the first millennium CE, a divergence that the genetic data places somewhere between 1700 BCE and 400 CE, a range so wide it encompasses the entire pre-modern era. The precise point at which smallpox became maximally lethal to humans is, in the current state of the evidence, unknown. The reclassification of smallpox from a medieval early modern disease to an ancient one was accomplished without significant institutional revision to any of the contexts in which smallpox has been historically framed. But the ancient origin does not resolve the behavioral implication that the genetic data raises. If smallpox variant viruses were circulating in human populations during the Bronze Age, during the same period when large-scale agricultural civilizations were consolidating in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, when population density in river valley settlements was rising rapidly, when trade networks were creating the first interregional connectivity, then those civilizations were being shaped from their earliest centuries by a pathogen whose mechanism of action they had no means to understand. The population collapses documented in Bronze Age Europe, the sudden abandonments of settlements that archaeologists have catalogued across Central and Northern Europe between roughly 2500 and 1500 BCE, the genetic bottlenecks visible in ancient DNA studies of European populations during this period, none of these can be directly attributed to ancient smallpox with current evidence, but none of them can be cleanly separated from it either. The gap between the earliest Bronze Age sample and the nearest written record is roughly 3,000 years. What happened in that gap is a question the dead can only partially answer. Number 3. The Neolithic decline. Around 5,500 years ago, the population of Europe collapsed by somewhere between a quarter and a half, and the event left no written record, no named pathogen, and no monument. The evidence for what happened to Neolithic European populations between roughly 3,500 and 3,000 BCE is not written anywhere. It is embedded in the soil, in the gradual disappearance of pollen from cultivated crops in lakebed sediment cores, in the shift in isotope ratios in human bone that signals a change in diet, in the sudden thinning of the archaeological record across hundreds of sites in northern and western Europe, and in the ancient DNA data that documents a genetic discontinuity so abrupt that it looks in the charts like the graph's edge drops off a table. Johannes Krause of the Max Planck Institute, Wolfgang Hack of the same institution, and a series of collaborating teams working from roughly 2015 to 2023 extracted ancient DNA from hundreds of individuals across Neolithic Europe, and found that the genetic profile of European farmers descended from Anatolian migrants who had spread agriculture westward across the continent over several millennia. Effectively disappears from the record in Western and Northern Europe during the 4th millennium BCE. It is replaced rapidly by a different genetic profile associated with pastoralist populations from the Eurasian steppe. The Neolithic decline is visible in individual sites in ways that the soil records can document even without DNA. At the site of Zwenkow in Saxony, the pollen record shows agricultural activity continuing steadily through the Middle Neolithic and then declining sharply around 3200 BCE. Cereal pollen drops. Weed pollen, the kind that grows when fields go untended, rises. Then, after a gap of several generations, a different suite of weeds appears, suggesting a different kind of land use rather than a resumption of farming. The people who had been farming at Zwenkow were not replaced in situ by different farmers. The fields were simply not farmed for a generation or more. Then someone else arrived. What happened in between is what the soil cannot say. The Neolithic decline entered scientific discussion primarily as a demographic phenomenon to be explained by a combination of factors: climate deterioration, soil exhaustion, deforestation, social instability, and, increasingly in recent years, epidemic disease. The disease hypothesis was strengthened significantly by a 2018 study led by Willerslev, also of the Copenhagen group, that identified Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, in individuals from Neolithic burial sites in Europe dating to approximately 3000 BCE. These were among the earliest confirmed Y. pestis infections in the archaeological record. The strain recovered was archaic, lacking some of the genetic features that make bubonic plague flea transmissible, suggesting a form of the disease that spread through direct contact rather than through the flea-rat human vector of the later Black Death. An early direct transmission plague, moving through dense sedentary agricultural communities that had no previous exposure and no acquired immunity, would have been capable of producing the mortality pattern visible in the Neolithic record. The Yersinia pestis finding in Neolithic European remains was published in Cell and was covered as a significant scientific discovery. It was framed in press coverage primarily as a prehistory of the Black Death, an origin story for a later, better-known epidemic. The Neolithic populations themselves, whose names are unknown and whose languages are unrecorded, and whose experience of the disease left no account anywhere, received passing reference. The official scientific consensus position, as of the most recent literature, is that the Neolithic decline was multicausal, climate, disease, and migration interacting in ways that current evidence cannot fully disentangle. The word multicausal is accurate. It is also the word one uses when the evidence for a single dominant cause is present but not yet conclusive. Yet the scale of what the ancient DNA documents is not multicausal in its outcome, whatever its cause. The Neolithic agricultural populations of Western Europe, the people who built Stonehenge's predecessors, who cleared the forests, who established the field systems visible from the air as crop marks in dry summers across Britain, France, Germany, and Scandinavia, were genetically replaced to a degree approaching totality in the space of roughly 5 to 10 generations. The steppe pastoralists who followed were not genetically similar to them. They carried different diseases. They had different subsistence strategies. Modern Europeans are genetically primarily descended from those steppe arrivals and from an earlier layer of hunter-gatherers, with the Neolithic farmers representing a minority contribution to the modern genome, even though the Neolithic farmers were for nearly 3,000 years the dominant population of the continent. Whatever happened between 3500 and 2800 BCE happened at a scale large enough to erase 3,000 years of demographic dominance from the genetic record of a continent. Number 2. The 1918 influenza pandemic. The most lethal epidemic in recorded human history killed between 50 and 100 million people in less than 2 years, and the official response included a decade of institutional silence so complete that the event was functionally forgotten within a generation. In the spring of 1918, the first documented wave of the influenza strain that would kill more people than the entire First World War appeared in Camp Funston, a military training facility in Kansas, where over 100 soldiers fell ill in a single morning. The camp physician reported the outbreak to the relevant military medical authority. The report was filed. The soldiers were quarantined within the camp. The camp continued to process and ship soldiers to the European theater. The infected soldiers shipped out before the quarantine was fully established or possibly after it, depending on which account of the timeline one uses. They arrived in France carrying the virus in March of 1918. The Western Front was, at that moment, the densest concentration of young men from diverse geographic backgrounds in the history of organized warfare. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers from North America, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, France, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, living in close quarters in a strip of northern France roughly 400 miles long. The physician Victor Vaughan, Surgeon General of the Army during the pandemic, described what he saw in military hospitals in France and later in American camps during the fall wave in terms that appear in his memoir, A Doctor's Memories, published in 1926. He described wards filling faster than beds could be set up. He described soldiers who walked into the ward under their own power and were dead by the time a doctor came to examine them, a speed of progression that he found unlike any influenza he had seen before. He described the characteristic feature of the most lethal cases, a blueness that began at the extremities and moved inward, a cyanosis produced by the lungs filling with fluid until the patient could no longer extract oxygen from breathing. The patient's faces turned a color he described as a deep violet gray, a color that the ward nurses learned to recognize as the indicator that a patient had hours, not days. He noted that the deaths clustered not in the elderly and the very young as seasonal influenza normally did, but in adults between 20 and 40, the precise age group of the soldiers, of the factory workers, of the young mothers and fathers. He found this distribution, he wrote, deeply disturbing in a way he could not adequately articulate. The 1918 influenza entered the public record in most participating nations in a severely compressed form. Military censors in the United States, Britain, France, and Germany suppressed or delayed reporting of the epidemic scale on the grounds that accurate mortality figures would damage civilian morale during the war. Spain, which was neutral, allowed its press to report freely, which is why the strain was named the Spanish flu, not because it originated there or was more severe there, but because Spain was the first country whose newspapers published the truth about what was happening. The naming was, in effect, a penalty for honesty. American newspapers covered the epidemic's fall wave, which was the most lethal, but were operating under informal pressure from the Committee on Public Information, Wilson's wartime propaganda body, to frame coverage in terms of resilience and continuity rather than mortality. Cities that held Liberty Loan parades in September and October of 1918, parades that gathered tens of thousands of people in public spaces, saw their death rates spike within 2 weeks. The parades were held anyway. The 1918 influenza was never the subject of a formal governmental reckoning in any of the major affected nations. There were no tribunals, no commissions, no official inquiries into the decisions that had been made about troop movements, about public gatherings, about the suppression of accurate reporting. The war ended in November of 1918, and the institutional energy that might have been directed toward accountability was absorbed by the peace negotiations, the demobilization, and the political crises of the post-war period. By 1920, American medical journals were already discussing the 1918 influenza in the past tense, as a completed event. By 1930, it had largely disappeared from popular memory in the countries that had suffered the most. The historian John Barry, writing in 2004, noted that an event that killed more Americans than all the wars of the 20th century combined was not mentioned in any standard American history textbook before the 1990s. And yet the institutional forgetting does not resolve the single most anomalous feature of the 1918 pandemic's clinical record, which is the cytokine storm hypothesis. The proposal that the virus killed young, healthy adults at high rates precisely because they had the most robust immune systems, and that the immune response itself, rather than direct viral damage, was the primary mechanism of death in the most lethal cases. If that hypothesis is correct, and it remains a subject of active research, not settled consensus, then the 1918 influenza represents a pathogen that specifically weaponized the biological fitness of the population most needed for agriculture, for industry, for childrearing, and for the social reproduction of civilization. The pandemic killed somewhere between 3 and 5% of the entire global human population in approximately 24 months. The survivors built the 20th century. The shape of that century, its labor movements, its political upheavals, its demographic shifts, its extraordinary anxiety about institutional authority, was laid down in part by a generation that had watched a third of their age cohort die while the governments responsible for their safety held parades. Number 1. The Columbian Exchange Epidemics. The series of overlapping epidemics that followed European contact with the Americas between 1492 and 1650 constitutes the largest proportional demographic catastrophe in the recorded history of any continent, and it happened so fast that the civilizations it destroyed had no time to record their own end. On the morning of November 8, 1519, the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés entered the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city built on an island in Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 broad causeways with a population of between 200 and 300,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that moment, comparable to Constantinople or Paris. Cortés had approximately 500 soldiers. The Emperor Moctezuma II, who came to meet him on the southern causeway, had an army numbered in the tens of thousands. Cortés was received as a guest. He was not received as a conqueror. The encounter that morning, the formal greeting on the causeway, the exchange of gifts, the procession into the city, was the culmination of months of Cortés's diplomatic and military maneuvering from the coast. It was also, although neither party could have known it, the beginning of the end of Tenochtitlan, not primarily because of the military force that Cortés had brought, but because of what was already moving invisibly through the population of the coastal communities his army had passed through. The smallpox that reached Tenochtitlan arrived ahead of the Spanish military return in 1520, carried by a soldier named Francisco de Eguía who had come with a reinforcement fleet and who was already infected when he landed. The Spanish, who had survived childhood smallpox exposure, were largely immune. The Nahua population had encountered nothing resembling this pathogen in the previous 10,000 years of human habitation in the Americas. No smallpox, no measles, no plague, no typhus, no influenza in its pandemic forms. The concept of acquired immunity existed in their medical framework only for diseases they had previously encountered. Francisco López de Gamarra, Cortés's secretary and biographer, described the epidemic in Tenochtitlan in the months before the final siege. The bodies of the dead lay in the streets because there were not enough living people to carry them away. The surviving warriors who held the causeways against the Spanish return in June of 1520 were fighting, in some cases with active smallpox lesions on their bodies. The city fell in August of 1521, after a siege of 80 days. When the Spanish entered the final quarter of Tenochtitlan, they found the streets so packed with bodies that they could not walk without stepping on the dead. Cortés later wrote that he wept. He then ordered the city demolished and a new city built on the rubble. The Columbian exchange epidemics entered the Spanish colonial record as a series of administrative complications. The encomienda system, through which the Spanish crown granted colonists the right to the labor of indigenous populations in exchange for their nominal Christianization, was dependent on the continued existence of a viable indigenous labor force. As the epidemics reduced that labor force, colonial administrators wrote increasingly urgent letters to Spain explaining the shortfall. Spain responded with revised tribute schedules, debates about the spiritual status of indigenous people, and, eventually, the importation of enslaved Africans to replace the labor supply that the epidemics had eliminated. The official framing was economic and theological. The mortality was acknowledged as extraordinary. It was not acknowledged as the consequence of European pathogen introduction. That framing, which is now standard in the historical literature, did not emerge until the 20th century. In the 16th century, Spanish clerics attributed the mortality to divine favor for the Christian project of conversion. The post-contact population decline in the Americas was formally estimated, with any methodological rigor, beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, when the demographers Woodrow Borah, Sherburne Cook, and Henry Dobbins began using colonial administrative records, archaeological site surveys, and the backcast extrapolation of census data to reconstruct per-contact population figures. Their estimates range from approximately 50 million to over 100 million people in the Americas at the moment of first contact, figures that were controversial when published and remain subjects of ongoing revision. The current consensus in historical demography accepts a per-contact population for the Americas of approximately 50 to 60 million, and a nadir population reached around 1650 of approximately 5 to 6 million. The decline, by those figures, was somewhere between 85 and 90% of the total population in 150 years. The specific pathogens responsible for specific episodes within that overall collapse have been identified in some cases: smallpox at Tenochtitlan, white pestis variants in some populations, the Cocoliztli salmonella strain in central Mexico, but the majority of the mortality remains uncoded to a specific agent. The epidemics came in waves, overlapping and reinforcing each other, moving through populations that had not recovered from the previous wave before the next arrived. A survivor of the 1520 smallpox epidemic in Tenochtitlan faced measles in 1531, typhus in 1545, the Cocoliztli in 1545 and again in 1576, a further smallpox wave in 1563, and influenza across multiple episodes. Each epidemic found a population that was nutritionally depleted, socially disrupted, and lacking the institutional infrastructure to quarantine, treat, or bury its dead in a way that slowed transmission. The cumulative effect was not a series of discrete disasters but a continuous state of dying that lasted, with brief intervals, for more than a century. 10 events, 10 different continents, climates, centuries, 10 different named pathogens or unnamed ones, or pathogens still being argued over in peer-reviewed journals by scientists who are working from bone dust and lake sediment and the gap between one census and the next. What they share is not a cause, not a geography, not a mechanism of transmission. What they share is this, in each case: the civilization experiencing the epidemic found a way to continue the official record while the actual record, the one written in the bodies, in the genetic discontinuities, in the abandoned fields and the untranscribed languages and the mass graves sealed with lime, accumulated below the threshold of what the living were able or willing to document. Every one of these events was larger than the war that surrounded it, preceded it, or followed it. Every one of them shaped the political world that came after in ways that the political histories never fully accounted for. We live in the aftermath of all 10, in a world whose population distribution, whose genetic composition, whose institutional memory is a direct product of who survived and who did not. The pathogen does not care about the official record. The official record is what the survivors wrote. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.